Everybody. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. My name is Zach Hatfield, and I'm the managing editor of Aperture magazine. It's my pleasure to welcome you to a conversation tonight with two incredibly talented artists and thinkers, Noam Elcott and Trevor Paglen, both of whom are featured in the most recent issue of Aperture magazine, which is called Image Worlds to Come, Photography and AI. This issue explores how photography and its relationship to creativity, truth, and authorship is being transformed by the vast spectrum of different and diverging programs, developers, materials, datasets, and frameworks that simply goes by AI. For those of you who might not be familiar with Aperture, we're a nonprofit publisher that leads conversations around photography worldwide. From our base in New York, Aperture connects a global audience and supports artists throughout the acclaimed publications and programming. Aperture's programs are made possible by the generosity of our board of trustees, our members, and other individuals, and in part by the New York State Legislature. I'd also like to thank our subscribers to Aperture Magazine, all of whom support Aperture and our programs. To briefly introduce our speakers today, Trevor Paglen is an artist whose work spans image making, sculpture, investigative journalism, writing, engineering, and numerous other disciplines to explore surveillance and systems of power. The recipient of the MacArthur Genius Grant in 2017, he's the author of I Could Tell You, But Then You Would Have to Be Destroyed by Me, Emblems from the Pentagon's Black World, Blank Spots on the Map, The Dark Geography of the Pentagon's Secret World, and The Last Pictures. Noam M. Elcott is a scholar of modern art and media whose work Artificial Darkness, An Obscure History of Modern Art and Media was awarded the 2017 Society for Cinema and Media Studies and Friedberg Innovative Scholarship Award. Elcott has two forthcoming books, Photography, Identity, Status, August Saunders, People of the 20th Century, and Art TM, A History of Modern Art, Authenticity, and Trademarks. He's an editor of the journal Grey Room and an associate professor in the Columbia University Department of Art History and Archaeology. Now our speakers will answer questions toward the end of the program, so please feel free to post your questions using the Q&A feature throughout the conversation. Thanks again for tuning in, and without further ado, I'll now pass it off to Noam and Trevor. If you guys want to unmute and turn your screens on now.
Hey there, Noam, you want to say hi? There you are. Great to be here with you. Thank you for everybody for coming out today. Thank you, Noam. Awesome to be in conversation again. We've been talking about this stuff for years at this point. So a lot of fun. I think this is our first public talk together, though. Is that right?
I think it is. So let's make it great.
Awesome. Well, I'll do a little presentation, then Noam, you'll do one, and then we'll kind of get into it from there. So I'm going to go ahead and share a screen. All right. Everybody should see my screen now. So I'm Trevor Paglen. I've been working with AI and computer vision for, about a decade at least. And I got interested in this topic because I could sort of see something happening in the world of images. I could sort of see that a moment was coming where most of the images in the world were going to be made by machines for other machines, and that humans would very rarely be in these loops. And I thought this is a really dramatic development in terms of the history of images, a bigger development perhaps than the invention of photography, perhaps a bigger development than the invention of perspective. Who knows? But nonetheless, something quite extraordinary. And so I started developing tools in my studio that were organized around a very simple seeming question, which is, how do machines see? And so this is a simple question to ask, but it's a very difficult one to answer. Computer vision and AI systems are often described by people who develop them as being, purely technical systems. But that's not really how visual perception works. Visual perception is on one hand physiological, but is also historical, cultural, subjective. It's very squishy in a lot of ways. And it's not just me saying this as a humanities person. This is, any neuroscientist would agree with that as well. So if that's the case, that if, computer vision systems broadly understood, are trying to do some kind of visual perception, and visual perception always entails these kinds of historical and cultural assumptions, even political assumptions, then what kinds of assumptions are being built into them, right? And so over the last decade or so, this has been a lot of the work is trying to excavate these forms of these kind of cultural and political embeddings that are inside computer vision and AI systems. So we can think about this purely formally. We can take images of things like clouds. You know, clouds in photography have a history associated with abstraction, from people like Turner to someone like Stiglitz, from Gerhard Richter to somebody like James Benning. So one question is, you apply different computer vision algorithms to clouds. What do they see? What kind of mathematical abstractions are they making out of these kind of imagistic abstractions? I think a lot about computer vision in relation to other forms of, imaging and power from the past. We can think about it in relation to people like Muybridge, O'Sullivan, Watkins, kind of figures from the 19th century West who were going out and surveying these, what at the time were often, quote unquote, unexplored territories. One of the many kind of side quests that I've done in this larger project is try to excavate the different kinds of artifacts from computer vision. Often these are internal artifacts, and I'll show you what I mean by that. The first facial recognition work was done in the early 1960s by a guy named Woody Bledsoe, who was working for the CIA. The CIA wanted a system whereby they could look at, have a computer look at photographs of people and be able to identify those people. And so a guy named Woody Bledsoe conducted that research in secret in the early 1960s. And the way he did that was by taking photographs of all the people that worked in his laboratory, measuring the key points on their faces, and trying to come up with a mathematical model of what he called a standard head, a kind of a generic head. And the idea was that you would take you would have this mathematical abstraction of a head, and then you would compare that to the photograph of an individual person. You look at the difference between the two, and that's somebody's facial fingerprint, as it were. And so I wanted to reconstruct this standard head. So I went through all of his papers and was able to kind of reconstruct this artifact, as it were, from the history of facial recognition, which is the first, abstracted head that was used to, at the very foundation of this work. And so I think about this as a kind of a 21st or 20th century version of a kind of Greek sculpture, but instead of the idealized form of the person being carved in marble, it's a mathematical abstraction. Gone through the history of facial recognitions and tried to make drawings and other images of these assumptions about what things like faces would look like. And then started to build other tools that would allow me to kind of probe the depths of different algorithms. These are portraits of Frantz Fanon and Simone Weil that are images of what a facial recognition system made for itself of what these people are meant to look like. And we can talk about why they're blurry and kind of impressionistic looking. But again, this is an image that the algorithm made for itself to make sense of other images. This is another one like that. This is of the sun. These are images of what are going on inside the quote unquote deep layers of a convolutional neural network, of a network. So we built tools that allowed us to kind of probe inside the quote unquote black box of an AI system and make images that were of what was going on at different places inside that black box. And again, you get these very weird kind of abstract images. And these are images, quote unquote images, that the computer is making for itself in order to make sense of other images. When you start getting into the world of AI stuff, you realize that training images are a very important part of this. So as you may or may not know, computer vision systems and machine learning systems are made by giving a neural network thousands, if not millions or even billions of images, and kind of inducing that network to try to recognize the difference between one image and another in order to do things like object recognition. So I was really interested in this history of photographs, really, that were made in order to teach machines how to see. This is an example of one of the pieces that came from that. This is looking at a very early data set from the early 1990s that was created by the military in order to give to laboratories to, again, reinvigorate this project of facial recognition that had begun in the 1960s, but really started getting going in the 1990s. Some of these other early data sets, remember what the origins of facial recognition technology happened before the age of, Facebook and Instagram. So in the 1990s, a big question was, you need a lot of digital pictures of people's faces in order to invent this technology. Where are you going to get them from? So one solution was to have this military data set, and the other one was to go to the FBI and create a data set from the faces of prisoners. So in a very real way, when we look at the history of AI, when we look at the history of facial recognition, one of the kind of pillars on which it stands is the faces of prisoners and other people that were in positions where they were not really able to consent to this stuff. When we look at larger data sets, we come to a very standard, kind of probably the most widely used of these data sets in object recognition was something called ImageNet. And this is a vast database of over 14 million images organized into 20-something thousand different categories. These are different installations that I've made kind of excavating that data set. And it's a data set that you use for general purpose object recognition. A machine learning system trained on ImageNet, for example, you can point it at an image of Magritte's like this, and it will tell you that, no, this is in fact definitively an apple. So this comes to one thing that we may or may not want to get into, which is that there is a kind of philosophy of representation that's built into computer vision systems. And this is something that I call machine realism, that there's a kind of philosophy that images correspond to things in the world, that correspondence is relatively transparent and is internally consistent. And this kind of very literalist way of seeing is quite at odds with how humans really make sense of images. That's something we can go into more if you want to. As you can imagine, when you're building these data sets, we've all heard about the problems of bias and prejudice and that sort of thing. And there are really deep problems with this approach. When we just look at the ImageNet data set itself, it has all kinds of nouns in it that are very suspicious, right? They can often be cruel. They can often be racist, misogynistic, homophobic. Just generally terrible. And this is a problem that is pretty endemic of these kinds of systems. These are, different works that I've done kind of that would take this most widely used data set for object recognition. It's a model that's only trained on the people categories from that. And you can kind of go and it'll take your picture and tell you what kind of person a model trained on this data set would describe you as. Now, when we think about the history of images, the way that humans typically use images is in a much more of an allegorical mode, where an image can have multiple meanings. Those meanings can change over time. The codes in a given image might be only legible to certain people in a certain culture, in a certain context, what have you. And so when we look at this history of allegory and kind of human meaning making, we find a history that's quite different than this kind of literalist or machine realism philosophy that we find in computer vision systems. So I wanted to see whether I could build machine learning models that kind of stop before this level of classification. Can I build machine learning models that are much more impressionistic? So I built a model that kind of stripped out that final layer of classification and would only show me what are called activations in the model. So it would look at an image and then arbitrarily assign different colors to different places in that image, depending on the places in the model that image was activating differently. I realize that sounded very technical, but I can explain what that means a little bit later. So that's what these works came from. The other thing I wanted to do was start building my own training sets. And so again, in this kind of allegorical mode, I was thinking a lot about the fact that images mean different things in different contexts. If in the context of psychoanalysis, if you tell your therapist that you had a dream where your teeth fell out, the takeaway message is not something about oral hygiene, right? These are symbols that we use to make sense of the world. And so I wanted to ask myself whether I could make these more training sets that are based on these more allegorical or symbolic ways of seeing. So I built models that would do things like this. And this is a model called the Monsters of Capital, and it's a classifier, but when you look around the room, the only thing that it can see are monsters that historically have been different allegories for different parts of a circuit of capital, for example. I started realizing, back in the day that you can essentially run these models backwards. Instead of using a model to classify something that's out in the world, you could use a model that's trained on one of these taxonomies to try to use it to generate images, to kind of create these synthetic images. And these are some of the synthetic images that I created using those models. As you can probably tell, this is the beginning of what we now call generative AI. And we might call this generative term in AI over the last few years another one of these watershed moments in the history of images. And I've been thinking a lot about how to make sense of this moment. And one of the historical analogs I've found is, weirdly enough, military psychological operations. And the reason for that is that right now there's kind of a convergence happening between research on neurology and perception and machine learning and generative AI. And this convergence is happening in such a way that there's a lot of work being put into, or a lot of research being done into what kinds of images, what kinds of media can manipulate people in different kinds of different kinds of ways. You can think about, social media as a giant experiment in this if you want to. So we're in this age of AI now, in this age of generative AI, and these kind of photographic looking images are, on one hand, becoming more and more ubiquitous, and on the other hand, have kind of become untethered from an external reality. So in photography, this old idea of indexicality, this is kind of gone. And I'm not totally sure that we've really thought through what the implications of that are kind of collectively. I think a lot about whether, if the Napalm Girl image came out tomorrow, or if the Abu Ghraib images came out tomorrow, would they have that same kind of cultural salience in a moment in time where it's possible to make any image of anything that you want? And if not, if those kinds of images are no longer culturally salient in the same way, then what happens? What's happening to images? I've been thinking a lot about what I called superpositional media. And this is an idea that I'm kind of borrowing from quantum physics. And in physics, it says that a quantum system can be in multiple positions at the same time, and kind of until it's measured. So I've been thinking about media whose representational status are similarly multiple things at the same time, and thinking about whether this is a concept that helps us shed light on the nature of images in the age of generative AI. So I think a lot about whether or not in this new world does every image become a form of an optical illusion like this, where you can either see a duck or you see a rabbit or you see, the white dress or the blue dress, depending on what your mind imagines that it's seeing. So photographic looking images may be becoming, purely psychical projections, like almost like image manifestations of whatever you're inclined to believe or have been nudged to believe. And in this way, maybe images are becoming kind of like magic tricks where you see whatever your mind expects to see. And I think this principle extends to questions of belief and questions of perception. So not only what we're inclined to believe, but what we're inclined to perceive. I weirdly think that UFO photographs are very relevant here, kind of plot twist. So why are UFO photographs relevant in this age of AI and online manipulation? Well, I think that the point of UFO photographs is not really to prove the existence of aliens, so much as the point is that they show each of us what we expect to see, or what we want to see, or what we're predisposed to see. These are UFO photographs are kind of like image objects that call forth the projections of whoever's looking at them. So if you're thinking about an AI model, right? You prompt an AI model and it gives you some kind of response. You can think about this genre of images as kind of being a prompt for you. It's an image that prompts you to come up with some kind of response to it, whether that is to elicit attention or do some kind of investigation or prompt you to imagine something or believe something, what have you. So I'm very much still looking at AI and trying to understand the kinds of dynamics that are built into it. My focus on the moment, however, is really about the ways in which machine learning can kind of weaponize perception. And I'm looking for these analogies to try to understand that in as many places that I can. So this is in real life meant a lot of time looking at things like the history of like mind control experiments, of like UFO photography, and the kind of relationships between these histories and phenomena and AI. And the reason for that is really, culture has gotten and is getting very, very weird. And I would submit to you that it's about to get a whole lot weirder. And we could just end it on that thought. And I'll pass it over to Noam.
I I love picking up from culture is getting weirder, which is about to get weirder, which is most certainly true. So first, a few quick thanks to Alex and Brianna for organizing the event, to Zach Hatfield for the kind introduction, and also along with Editor-in-Chief Michael Famietti for this superb special issue on photography and AI. The cover is, of course, one of Trevor's images that we just saw. All my work with Aperture and much of my thinking on photography is in dialogue with Sarah Meister, Executive Director of Aperture. The research for this presentation and for the Aperture essay was conducted in close collaboration with Tim Trombley at Columbia University, who is an AI autodidact of fierce intellect. And finally, it is a genuine pleasure, more than a pleasure, really an honor to be in dialogue with Trevor Paglen. My baptism into the world of AI came through Trevor's work, and particularly the exhibition at Metro Pictures that we saw a quick glimpse of, and a seminar that he led in 2017. If I can ever open someone's eyes as much as Trevor opened mine, I will die a contented scholar and teacher. With that, I'm going to run through a few slides, describe some of the work that I've done with Tim, and at the very end of this brief presentation, there's going to be a collective quiz. No one's graded, but we're actually going to hold these results. I want to know the degree to which people can tell AI generated images from real images. And the test case in the special issue was Dorothea Lange. I'll show those slides. We'll do a new quiz for August Sonder, the mid-20s interwar German photographer who tried to catalog all of humanity, people of the 20th century. So we'll get back to that in just a second. The first major point that, so just to describe the work that Tim and I did, we trained a couple of models, or we fine-tuned a couple of models for generative AI. So instead of simply defaulting to whatever standard stable diffusion or any of the other major commercial generative AI models offer, we took stable diffusion as a base and we fine-tune it with our own data sets, specifically pulling from the Farm Security Administration and Dorothea Lange and Walker Evans and others, as we'll see in just a second, and a second data set coming from August Sonder's ample photographs of peasants. And we use that to run all kinds of experiments. And among the key items that that have to be foregrounded is that there is no such thing as AI photography. There are images that AI can generate that look like photographs, just like it can look like pencil drawings or anime or you name it. But there is simply no such thing as AI photography. And we give a few examples. You can see here, this is the same prompt. The images on the right side of your screen are the default settings for stable diffusion. So it obviously has very little, if any, Alexander in its training data set. So provides us kind of a sexy Disney cartoonish princess type figure. And on the far left is our model at 100%. And those are images that not only approximate photography, but actually approximate the photography of Alexander reasonably well. We've done it even better since, and I'll show some examples of those at the end. And so again, image on the left looks like a photograph, image on the right looks like a cartoon. These are generated the exact same way. There's no ontological essential difference between the two of them. And again, just note this transformation right about the halfway point. You can see there, the two models are fighting with each other, creating a very awkward and discombobulated image there. In these three, we basically had the model go from Alexander, an old lady according to Alexander, to Studio Ghibli. And again, these are all produced the exact same way. So there's no such thing as AI photography. There are AI generated images that look like photographs. And the fundamental argument that we made is that photography is a style for AI, or more precisely, a suite of styles, because you can have daguerreotype photographs, you can have 16mm film images, you can have digital XLR, you can have SLR, excuse me, you can have Polaroid. These are all styles from the perspective of a model, just as watercolor is a style or impressionist painting is a style. So once we established that, we wanted to see what the model could actually teach us. And toward that end, we trained a number of LoRAs. LoRA just stands for low rank adaptation. It's a way to fine tune a very large model on the cheap. And because we had relatively little access to powerful computers, this is the technological solution that we arrived at. Turns out to have been adopted actually quite widely as well at this time. And we trained we fine-tuned models for Gordon Parks, for Dorothea Lange, and much less successfully, and this is important to note, for Walker Evans. And we compared the output with the exact same prompt for each of those models against Stable Diffusion XL's generic production when given the prompt. Now, the first thing you should note is that the Stable Diffusion, a photo of two boys reading comic books by, you name the artist, in this case, FSA photographer, it's obvious that unlike Alexander, they have a lot of FSA photographs in the model. And because the FSA photographs are publicly available on the Library of Congress website, there's almost no question that all the major models have digested FSA photography. So Gordon Parks, Dorothea Lange, Walker Evans, all of the FSA photographers, extremely well represented and easy, comparatively easy for the models to produce. But even so, you can tell dramatic differences between these specialized fine-tuned models. Gordon Parks, different subjects. So they're Black boys, African-American boys in an urban setting versus the Dorothea Lange. They're out somewhere in the American West wilderness, what have you. Interesting in all the models, irrespective of the details, they're all fantastically well-coiffed boys. They only have perfect hair. Similarly, a photo of a woman looking out her window by each of these figures. We didn't ask about race. We didn't ask about location. It's the data and the mining of the data in terms of patterns and relationships automatically foreground certain types of subjects. And I'll go to this, jump to this last one. Note how similar the Walker Evans image is to the generic FSA photographer image. And while we can't know definitively why certain images are created by models, we did recognize that for complex reasons that we can maybe get back to in the Q&A if there's interest, it actually had enormous difficulty training on Walker Evans. So from at least our initial experiments with AI, all of the truisms about Walker Evans refusing meaning and refusing discrete, obvious meaning seems to hold in our efforts to train it. So what we end up with when asking for Walker Evans is basically just a generic FSA photographer. What would be unique and special to Walker Evans proved extremely hard for us to train. It also picked up on details within the archive that we didn't even necessarily notice at first. So all the way on the left are the images produced when our model was at 100%. All the way at the right is when our model is at 0%. And if you look at, say, either of these images, in fact, the bottom image, the bottom set of images is even better. At this point, Gordon Parks, and this is very early in his career, at this point, he really loved this heroic low point of view. So shooting up at his figures. And as you can tell, that is almost completely eliminated once the specific data set was taken out of the equation. And the last thing we did, and this is just the setup for our final quiz, which will come in just a moment. We produced a number of Dorothea Lange style images and asked people to quiz themselves if they can distinguish the real photographs from the AI photographs. Importantly, for all the images, we made sure that the aspect ratios were the same, so there were no giveaways. And in this one, if image on the top left is number 1 and it goes across 1, 2, 3, 4, and the bottom row 5, 6, 7, 8, 1 and 7 are the real Dorothea Langes. And in this set, well, I can come back to it later, but these are almost all AI images. The idea behind latent specificity is that by training models on specific data sets, you can create images that have far more nuanced texture and meaning than are available using the off-the-shelf commercial models. So the image on the right is basically the crappiest of the crap that generative AI can do. This looks, of course, nothing like a Dorothea Lange photograph. It looks more like an image you might see on a cheap wine label. The middle image is certainly better and approximates something that you would associate with mid-century, though there's nothing about it that speaks to Dorothea Lange at all. The image on the left, which is one of the better images that we were able to generate with our Dorothea Lange LoRa model, you see not only an image that very closely approximates Dorothea Lange, you also see all of the nuances of a Library of Congress card. The cardboard, the dark cardboard mount, the lettering at the top, all of those things are being picked up with remarkable subtlety by the model. Home stretch. I'm finishing a book now on August Zonder, and have thought a lot about August Zonder's attempt to catalog all of humanity in his time, people of the 20th century, focusing on Germany, but it's a compilation of 600 photographs divided into 7 overarching groups, and then subdivided into 50 portfolios, each one with about 12 photographs. And each of these portfolios was to represent an abstract type. So I'm trying to chart the relationship between August Zonder's unfinished project beginning in the mid-1920s, all the way to AlexNet and to our present. And toward that end, we did a little bit of training for August Zonder. And what I'd like everyone to do, I believe that we're going to drop there it is, an August Zonder poll. And the question that you should ask, you're to answer is, which of these 8 images are real August Zonder photographs? So not the AI images. You're looking for the real McCoy, the real August Zonder photographs. I should note that the August Zonder photographs have been cropped into squares. That's not a format he ever printed images in, but for that very reason, we needed to have them all conform to the same aspect ratio. So please, you can choose as many or as few as you want. Please do take a minute. This is going to be fascinating for me and for my further research to know how well these images are visible. My suspicion, I will say, is that in a few years' time, we're all going to be able to tell the difference between real and generative AI images circa 2025. I think that it's relatively difficult and subtle today, but I'm not convinced that that subtlety is going to be able to hold up against the march of time. But we won't know unless we do studies like this. So please participate. We'll give people a few minutes. And Trevor, you want to come back and we can get this conversation going?
Hello.
Hello, hello.
So Noam, like in your article, I was really interested in the end part of it, right? Where you sort of, the ending is a little bit squishy, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way or anything like that, because my own thoughts are quite squishy about this as well. But I wanted to just ask you, where do you think this is going? You know, because you seem like on one hand you're like, oh, there's this new stuff that's happening, but also questions. Like what's your overall vibe?
I think vibe is the right word for sure. The vibe of where generative AI is going.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a big one. We're going
Well, let's
there.
narrow it down. Let's talk about photography then, or photographic looking images, which I want to ask you about that as well.
Yeah,
But
I, and it's moving very quickly, and I think that there are all kinds of photographs that are rapidly approaching extinction. I think that I think it's impossible to overstate the threat to commercial photographers. I
Mhm.
think that anything like a commercial photo shoot, advertising shoots, product shoots, um, all the bread and butter of a lot of working photographers who maybe are also doing artistic projects but have to pay the rent through other means. I think there's a massive jeopardy because it's so incredibly easy to create uh, excellent looking images, photographic like images, without any cameras and human intervention, or maybe very, very little. I think that on some level, the threat is even greater than that because people, I suspect, are going to be fed, and this is going to tie into your PSYOPs observations and insights. I think people are going to be fed highly manipulated photographs and eventually generated images and come to prefer those.
Mhm.
So even, I think our best iPhone photos are the ones that are algorithmically driven. Um, it's a misnomer to think of, camera phones as being real photographs and generative AI being fake, when in fact, as Trevor, as you know very well, there's so many algorithmic interventions into an iPhone photograph. And when you take that photograph and then post it on social media, it undergoes even more algorithmic interventions so that by the time we arrive on an online circulated photo, something on social media, is that a real photograph any longer, or is that an algorithmically generated image? The answer is yes, right? It is,
Mhm.
it's got some, bones that are real photography, and it certainly has more indexicality than a pure generative AI artifact, but it is so deeply shot through with algorithmic interventions that the aesthetic style begins to lose I think, its vital connection to the world of photography. And as we come to expect images, even photographic images, to look more and more like algorithmic images, I suspect we will we will see real photographs as being old and antiquated and belonging to our parents' or grandparents' generation. And in that regard, the threat to photography, I think, is tremendous.
Mhm. Is that something that you worry about? And if so, why? I mean, other than, I guess for the collective brains of humans.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. Then I want to flip and ask you a whole bunch of questions. But I think that photography is produced in manifold manners, and there's so much interest and insight in so much photography. Generative AI overwhelmingly is fantastically boring by design.
Mhm.
They are the way these major models are structured is to deliver the most blandly attractive image possible. And that is what sells, that is what circulates, that seems to be what people want. And to shift from a practice that has produced endless variation and intricacy to one that produces endless repetition would be, to my mind, an aesthetic disaster. It also outsources our visual culture to a handful of companies, even more than is the case in the present. So I think there's a lot at risk here, and I think that a very, very minor way to push back is to train our own models, to interfere, to use, to bring AI around toward our need. An even more important form of resistance is to continue to take photographs and make sure that those photographs find homes and circulations, like Aperture magazine. I'm looking at the clock, and there's so much in your work and presentation that I want to address. I guess two big points. One on machine vision and human vision, and one on paranoia.
Okay.
A term that I almost never come across in my AI discourse is ANNs. So CNNs are convolutional neural networks, and we talk about DNNs, deep neural networks, but ANNs are artificial neural networks, and it's a term that is used much less in computer science or visual culture or art, what have you, but is extensive in neuroscience.
Yeah.
The artificial neural network is a neural network that aims to imitate a human neural network. And not only as an inspiration, neural networks were always inspired by humans. The connections in the 50s and 60s were recognized to be fantastically weak, but in theory, like one day. Today, neuroscientists believe that specialized artificial neural networks can reasonably imitate aspects of human neural networks. And interestingly enough, vision is considered the benchmark for proximity to actual human neural networks, so that you can create artificial neural networks that self-design themselves in a manner so the cognitive neuroscientists very closely approximates what is happening in actual human vision. So the framework that you and I and others adopted from Feroki and Kittler and German media theory that was and remains incredibly powerful, of images made by machines for machines, and humans are basically out of the loop. We're seeing a new turn in this story in which suddenly machines are making and seeing images as proximate to human vision as possible in order to understand actual human vision and, by extension, human cognition. Where are you in, or what are your thoughts on some of this work and how we begin to process and think through critically what is massive, like a massive development in neuroscience?
I'm smiling very broadly. This is the rabbit hole that I'm in right now, like very hardcore. And so yeah, they use this language of ANNs. The other thing that's a really funny bit of language that they use is they use light stimulus, like that's their name for an image, right? So they don't even talk about images as images, like so much as like stimulus patterns that elicit certain kinds of neural responses, right?
Yes.
And so in that paradigm, what an image is almost like a visual hallucination of like a particular like pattern of neurons firing, right? So it's a very weird kind of world that vocabulary and that conception lives in. Is there something? Yeah, there's something to it, right? In other words, like there are real results that are being made with those models. Most of that work is being done on mice and on monkeys, and all kinds of weird stuff that's happening there. There is a kind of tension in the sense that the the version of neural networks that are popular now and that are used in object, classification, things like that, are really built on a model of a neurological theory of visual perception from the 1970s, that hasn't really been updated. When you look at the neurological literature on visual perception, it gets updated from there to start, realizing, oh, well, if you and I look at an apple, that doesn't mean that the same patterns of neurons is firing in our brain. In other words, like this, that visual perception is highly situated, has all of this squishy stuff that goes into influencing it. And so they're sort of trying to square that circle with, how do you have a universal conception of vision and images while at the same time understanding that brains are, enormously plastic, right? And that, my brain, sees differently than yours. So the way I feel like we're going down a rabbit hole now, but I mean, the way they do it is by creating, when they're experimenting in humans, the way they do it is by creating custom data sets for each individual person, right? So it's enormously laborious. But once you do that, you can do weird things like make predictions about what kind of media will activate what kind of brain pattern in a given subject's, mind. That's where I'm getting all this psyop stuff from and all this magic stuff from.
Just to pull one high level reflection on your amazing insights here. The in the first with the first digital revolution and then generative AI, the fear was that you wouldn't be able to trust the world anymore.
Yeah.
And the much of the response was, well, as long as we're still dealing with real human bodies and actual physical images,
Mhm.
then like we're at least safe there.
Yeah.
We're safe in understanding our own bodies and our own
Yeah.
physical things. Like, okay, so maybe those images that you showed on screen aren't real, but this, I can hold
Yeah.
on to. And I think much of what we're seeing in cognitive neuroscience tells us that no,
Yeah.
we can actually like show light stimuli. They're not even images. They're
Yeah.
basically abstract images, is what we would call them,
Mhm.
that can stimulate the brain in very precise and very predetermined manner, so that the body itself is no longer a locus of absolute resistance or
Mhm.
absolute externality, alterity from
Yeah.
complex systems. And that's another turn. I mean, I don't know that we're going to have time to get down fully the paranoia discussion, but
Mhm.
but the I think it's worth taking at least one beat. What do we do under these conditions where you the old adage is just because you're paranoid doesn't mean
Yeah.
no one's following you.
Yeah.
How do we operate today as critical thinkers, as photographers, as everyday consumers of media, as artists, as art historians? What level of paranoia is appropriate, and how is that? How can we change?
It's funny. Like, I've been trying to think through this question of what our image is becoming, right? And so there's many ways to answer that. You can think about it in this kind of neural activation framework. Um, my other hobby lately has been like really bugging medievalist religious studies professors, about, the status of images like pre-photography, and kind of thinking about if you live in a world that presupposes that images are essentially like imaginal objects, what is the worldview that inculcates in you, right? And it's not really that's not, in some ways it's not really the right place to look, because when you look at, pre-photographic image culture, it's in churches and things like that, and people would see very few images, in the course of a lifetime, and certainly couldn't make them. Um, but there is a question of I guess like what the metaphysics of reality are, I guess, or what common sense is, in an environment like that. And I share your suspicion that the next version of, our kind of visual common sense will probably have this kind of paranoid flavor to it. I mean, the evidence is everywhere already for that.
But when you're paranoid, it always is.
And that's not to say paranoid in a productive way. I mean, like this can be incredibly destructive.
Yeah. No, I think I'm about to publish a piece on Arthur Jafa and some of his recent work, especially his remake, so to speak, of the last minutes of Taxi Driver, where he recognized that most of those actors should have been black. They shouldn't have been white. It didn't make any sense. So he changes them to black. And in relationship to Joseph White, humorous name given that he's the father of black psychology, Joseph White talks about a productive paranoia, like a productive black paranoia. And he writes, part of the objective condition of black people in this society is that of a paranoid condition. There is and has been unwarranted systematic persecution and exploitation of black people as a group. A black person who is not suspicious of the white culture is pathologically denying certain objective and basic realities of the black experience. And that's, again, quoting Joseph White in the foundational essay from 1970. That strikes me as very close to where the basically total population is now arriving. And I wonder if photography for you, like where is photography going to play? And photography is as real photography, not as the generative AI stuff, but actual real photography. It's interesting to me that you're going backwards now and looking at falsified, ostensibly real photographs. Are you also looking forward and trying to imagine what type of images or what type of relationships to images are possible?
I am. And the forward-looking work is much weirder, though. I mean, I'm thinking much more about like post-representational works. I'm thinking a lot. Again, this is in dialogue with a lot of guys who are doing this neuroscience research and sort of thinking about. I mean, there's a lot of different polls that I have. Like one poll that I have is thinking about proof of work, right? So in other words, like images or artworks where you as a viewer can see the work that went into it. That could be an example, just like a Polaroid photograph, right? So, but you have a kind of intuitive common sense understanding that you can trust, like where that object came from, and have some idea of how it was made, right? And so I think that there is a kind of saliency that comes from that. On the aesthetic side, was related to that as well. I do think you have with the generative world this kind of what Hedo calls mean images. In other words, like these statistically kind of middle of the road, very generic images. And I think you'll see a reaction to that, in the form of people using crappy cameras, shooting in weird styles. I mean, so I think there will be a kind of a reaction to that image culture.
Yeah. What's interesting is I'm seeing I'm sure you've seen it as well, an elaborate. So there's a huge community of people who make these fine-tuned models.
Yeah.
And one of the fine-tuned models that we played around with a lot, which someone just threw out there for everyone to use, is called boring realism.
Yeah.
And it's a way of you get to generate photographs, but they look like plain old bad snapshots before your iPhone or smartphone made everything perfect and adjusted all the lighting and adjusted the balance and even perhaps got you the best crop, et cetera, et cetera. Boring realism is now a style. So and as is almost everything that you can possibly imagine.
Totally. But I think that's where you're going to see this kind of race happening, like this you're going to see an ever-changing stylistic evolution of what constitutes something that you can trust visually, I guess. Is that like what it would kind of come down to? Like, what is the aesthetics of trust? And I think that's going to change a lot and be ever in flux in kind of an interesting way. Right.
Yeah,
I mean,
interesting.
think about like the Blair Witch Project, right? When
Yeah,
it came out, it was like using this aesthetics of like the handheld camera as a way of, you know, creating this aesthetics of objectivity or something like that.
yes. I
So you
I I love that movie so much, and it scared me fantastically. And
completely,
I just don't think I could get scared like that again.
no, exactly. But there that will be a trajectory, I think, right? And then I think there's going to
I'm
be a
less. Oh, sorry. Go
yeah.
ahead.
Oh, and then I think the third trajectory is, you know, forms of synthetic media that are are jumping the conversation about aesthetics and images and things like that in like entirely. I've been thinking a lot about Doritos, with like, you know, in the sense that like thinking about Doritos are things that you eat that kind of have some relationship to food in terms of how you ingest them, but they're not food. They're industrial devices designed to like maximally activate your, you know, different, you know, preconscious, you know, sensory, you know, sensorium, right?
Yeah.
And to do that in a way that is more powerful than anything that would exist in nature,
Yeah.
right? And so,
That's great.
what's that?
I mean, it's super depressing, but I think it's a great actual note to nearly end on because I think Doritos is our visual culture future.
I've been thinking a lot about Doritos weirdly.
Okay, there's one we don't have a ton of time for questions. There was one. It's in our defense, it's hard to read questions while we're also trying to have a conversation. So but there is one I think good one, and or there are many good ones, but there's one that we have time for. Someone asks how Robert asks how difficult is it to create a customized image database for a generative AI? And I would interpret that question as if you want to break out, how can you do it? And I'll give a quick answer and then hand it off to Trevor for the final word. But there are any number of open model, okay, of open model systems that allow for all kinds of play, and you don't have to be a programmer to necessarily do it yourself. You can piggyback on all of these LoRa's that other people create and other these fine tunings that people create. And then if you get really ambitious, you could try to train your own. That is harder. I don't think I could do that, but I work with Tim who does do it, which is fantastic. Trevor, what are your thoughts?
I weirdly, I've thought about this. I'm teaching class about this over the summer, and I have a little bit of another theory that actually ChatGPT is the killer app of photography. Not because you ask it questions, but because you can code with it, right? And so like it makes it enormously easy for somebody with no coding experience to start developing their own image processing tools, right? Or even image capture tools. And so to your question about how easy is it to train stuff, um, it's pretty easy at this point, but I really do think you spend a week with the ChatGPT coding interface, and you know it'll tell you exactly what to do and how to do it, and will also help you debug it. And so I do think that there will be a whole lot of kind of DIY tools and processing that will emerge from the lowering of the barriers of entry to like people writing their own stuff.
That's a beautiful note to end on. Trevor, it's always a pleasure.
Thank you. Super fun. Appreciate you.